So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So first of all, I would like to take this opportunity to wish every one of you a very healthy and happy 2011. And also wish you a very happy Chinese New Year of Rabbit. Rabbit means react very swiftly. So my name is Zhu Gaozhang, Director of Compliance and Facilitation of the World Customs Organization. I'm very honored to be the moderator of this session. Today, I would like to start this session by citing the first sentence from the first page of the brochure for the Congress. So that is, counterfeiting and piracy are global problems that affect us all. So this topic of our session is the costs of the cleaning up, which is one of these problems we're going to discuss and to which we're trying to find the solutions. So as we all know, governments and the private sectors have expressed their concern regarding the question of who is to bear the costs of storage and the destruction of counterfeit goods and pirated goods. So in some countries, the costs of destruction, including storage costs, have to be borne by the right holders, who can afterwards attempt to recover these costs from the infringer, but not always succeed. In other cases, especially when dealing with the criminal proceedings, the state concerned normally bears the costs for storage and destruction, which has a significant cost implications, in particular in developing countries. It has been found that this situation often results in deterrent process and sometimes daunting the right holders and authorities' enforcement initiatives. In a time of financial constraints, suitable solutions for all stakeholders must be found, aiming towards a more balanced approach in the fight against counterfeit and piracy. So today, we have four speakers. They will speak on this issue. They are Mr. Antonis Kastriansianakis, and Mr. Patrick Mohan, and Mr. Chris Merchant, and Mr. Stephen Morris. So before I give the floor to them, there is a small announcement. So that is, every speaker has only 5 minutes to make the statement. After all speakers have made their statements, there will be a half an hour discussion. So followed by 15 minutes question and answer session. So the discussion, the audience is welcome to participate. So our first speaker, Mr. Antonis Kastriansianakis. So he's the Director of Safety and Security, Trade Facilitation International Cooperation within the European Commission's Directorate General Taxation and Customs Union. He's responsible for the coordination of customs and taxation aspects of the EU internal relations and of issues such as security, trade facilitation, protection of citizens, enforcement of intellectual property rights, and rules of origin. The coordination of the European Commission's participation in the work of the WCO also falls under his remit. He joined the European Commission in 1981 and was head of several units in the Directorates General Employment, Development, and Regional Policy, as well as a member of the Task Force for Administrative Reform. So his university background includes philosophy, politics, and economics in Oxford, the Law School of Athens, and advanced European studies at the College of European in Bruges. Now let's welcome Mr. Antonis to give his statement with applause.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. And thank you to all organizers, Interpol, the WCO, WIPO, BASCAP, and INTA, for for inviting the European Commission to speak at this important event. And it's also an honor for me to be here alongside my dear colleague Zhu Gaojian and the other distinguished panelists. In this session, we shall tackle the issue of costs, a difficult part of the IPR enforcement agenda. Not surprisingly, I shall be looking at this from the EU perspective, and in my opening intervention, will focus on one aspect: the costs incurred when customs intervene on goods suspected of infringing intellectual property rights. There is consensus that the infringer should be liable for the damage resulting from illicit use of the right holder's intellectual property, as well as for the costs incurred in enforcing those rights. However, this is a sensitive issue in the framework of customs enforcement, particularly as the potential infringer may well be based outside the EU or even be unknown. With regard to customs enforcement, the reference to costs in the EU regulation covers the time period between the detention of the suspect shipment and the decision to address the court. Customs intervene before an infringement has been established. The role of customs is, therefore, to identify and detain suspect shipments, and the decision whether or not there is an infringement is for the court. Our customs legislation places the burden of costs related to storage and destruction on right holders. As part of the application for customs action, right holders sign a declaration in which they undertake to bear these costs. Of course, this does not preclude them from seeking redress through the court in accordance with the common criminal or civil IPR enforcement law. However, the basic system in that is that goods are detained under customs supervision and following a court decision are disposed of also under customs supervision, though not at the expense of customs. We also have a simplified procedure which allows in some circumstances for the goods to be destroyed on the basis of an agreement between the right holder and the supposed infringer, without the case actually going to court. Again, the burden of destruction is not on customs, but on the right holder, unless he has made alternative arrangements with the other party. The whole issue of recovering costs from infringers is problematic. As I have said already, there is consensus that the final attribution of costs should be borne by the infringer. Yet, in the wider debate on the issue of costs, what happens in the absence of an identified and solvent infringer? Should the right holders have the possibility of recovering costs from intermediaries, such as the carriers? As far as the EU is concerned, the appropriate forum for treating these questions should be the more general IPR enforcement legislation. And in this context, I should like to draw your attention to the recent public consultation launched by the European Commission. At the end of last year, the European Commission presented a report on the application of the 2004 directive concerning the enforcement of intellectual property rights. The report and accompanying analysis covers damages and costs, as well as corrective measures. A public consultation on the report was launched on 11th January and runs until the end of March. So the Commission would welcome contributions from all stakeholders on this consultation. I should like to finish with a short comment on the possible constraints in developing countries. The border enforcement of IPR raises questions of administrative capacity. The EU works actively, also with the World Customs Organization, to support capacity building initiatives around the world on a number of customs activities. It may nevertheless be more realistic to assume that there are significant financial constraints for all administrations. The global economic downturn has affected everyone, and in a context where cuts are being made across most administrations, the burden of IPR enforcement should not be underestimated. That being said, in the EU, we are committed to robust border enforcement and look to finding pragmatic solutions in partnership with the stakeholders. To conclude, the issue of costs in the framework of customs interventions is an element of the overall question. It will be interesting to hear other perspectives, and in particular, I'm keen to hear industry on the contribution of the private sector to support effective, sustainable enforcement. Thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you, Mr. Antonis, for your very clear statement. So our next speaker is Mr. Patrick Mohan. Mr. Patrick Mohan is the National Commander of the Customs Border Control in South Africa. He is the first national commander of this paramilitary unit, which he practically established in the year of 2007. In 2009, his spell with the unit was temporarily broken when he was tasked with the establishment of the first Customs Risk Management Unit. After establishing this unit, he was recalled to Customs Border Control Unit in November 2010 to become its national commander once more. Prior to that, he was the National South African Revenue Service Campaigns Manager between 2005 and 2007. Before this position, he was the Senior Research and Analysis Unit Officer. His educational background includes BSO and BS Science degree and BSc Science Honors in the University of Northwest, developed in criminal justice and forensic auditing, and a graduate certificate, graduate diploma, and a master degree in international law of customs in the University of Canberra. So now, I would like to invite Mr. Patrick to give his statement. Let's welcome him with applause.
The organizers, the partners in the organization of this event, the sponsor, honored participants, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for inviting us as South Africa to participate in this sixth Global Congress on Combating Counterfeit and Piracy. It is indeed our honor to be part of this, and we are humbled by the opportunity to come and state our case in this global sketch relating to counterfeit and IPR. You'll remember, all of you, that in the middle of 2010, we were hosting the FIFA 2010 Soccer World Cup competition, which went very well in terms of organization. But indeed, we had a big challenge in terms of dealing with the contraventions relating to IPR. And indeed, we worked very closely with the legal fraternity, with the partners, with the brand holders in terms of fighting this. But our fight could only take us to as far as our limitations stand. It is for that reason that whilst I'm standing in front of you, I'll be trying to move very swiftly towards what I think may be the solutions to dealing with this particular sketch. That is, after Mr. Castriciacanas had set up eloquently what are the causes and the effects of this particular sketch in all of us. I'm not going to bore you in repeating what he has already indicated. Therefore, I'm going to, first of all, start with the examination of the liability in this total supply chain. My approach will definitely be that you will see it as we go along, that in examining the liability, we need to understand the role of each and every player in the supply chain. What we are saying is that the chain is as strong as its weakest link. Therefore, when we examine the liability and the the role or the liability that needs to be put on the shoulders of each and every role player. We need to examine it with that particular aspect in mind. The first point that I have in examination of the liability is that the importer, who is basically in the country of destination, is liable for due diligence in terms of reasonably being expected to ensure that one does not import counterfeit goods. That's as simple as that. In terms of criminal procedures, what we need to do, and then what we need to try and work out in terms of our respective national areas, we need to establish or criminal prosecutions in pursuit of the precedent where the importer is held by the court to be liable for the storage and destruction of the cost, which currently lies on the shoulders of the brand holders. I definitely think it's a little bit unfair for the brand holders to bear the costs of storing the goods as well as the destruction. So we need to devolve it down the supply chain, starting with the importers. So joint and several liability where the importer cannot be found needs to be established. I'm still purporting that somebody down the supply chain needs to be held liable or responsible for specific action. Therefore, it goes without saying that the role of the clearing agents, the freight forwarders, and the distributors or the manufacturers themselves needs to be examined internally. You cannot do that without forming the relationships with the between customs and customs, between customs and private organizations. In terms of recovering the costs from the infringers, before going down to defining what the infringer or who the infringer is in this supply chain, I would argue for the devising of an education program that publicizes the fact that the infringer will be liable for costs. That should go down definitely to say that the infringer will be traced down and then he will be made liable for all the costs relating to the importation or the movement of the counterfeited and pirated goods. And the infringer should be clearly defined, especially in cases where goods are obviously counterfeited and where the importer claims ignorance while denying the liability, which is the case in most instances. Investigate the creation of an international standards that defines clearly the processes and which seeks to shift the cost of IPR compliance to the infringer. We need to expand the definition of the infringer to include the supplier. Finding the supplier and the manufacturer should be the end result. And that can be achieved, ladies and gentlemen, through customs to customs relation and ensuring that we implement the provisions of the bilaterals and the multilateral agreements that we have in place. Otherwise, there will be the value of they will be equal to the value of the paper that they are written on. Government facilitated efforts to locate the supplier in the export country to recover the storage and destruction of the costs. On the third aspect of my presentation, which deals with financial constraints of the developing countries, I'm sure the financial constraints are dispersed across the entire global role players, but it is felt highly in the developing countries because of obvious reasons. Financial constraints of developing countries in terms of the allocation of scarce resources to IPR intervention and costs incidental to the disposal of such goods to be balanced with the fact that many developing countries operate with scarce resources. Of course, in South Africa, it is the brand holders that absorb the cost incidental to the storage and destruction of the counterfeit goods. But the cost of employing more resources to tackle the issues relating to IPR makes us to shift the resources from other social responsibility activities or developing countries to concentrate our resources on that particular aspect. That, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the costs related to fighting IPR. The contribution of the private sector to the cost-effectively and socially relevant enforcement. International IPR Association could form regional associations, which can then coordinate efforts in combating IPR violations. Such an approach could include public awareness campaign per industry sector. One aspect socially relevant enforcement is where brand holders shift some of their manufacturing operations to those developing countries that are seen to be proactively protecting the intellectual property of brand holders. Socially relevant IPR enforcement is key within certain industries from a public health and safety point of view, such as pharmaceutical industry, motor vehicle parts, etc. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to pause there because there will be an opportunity for all of us to share our ideas in a round-table discussion. But my point of conclusion is that we need to be able to devolve the responsibility of fighting IPR along the entire supply chain. It cannot be only the brand holders and the customs organization that have to fight this particular sketch. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So thank you, Mr. Patrick. He touched upon the issue in a more practical way. So our next speaker is Mr. Chris Merchant. Mr. Chris Merchant is the Security Director Europe EMEA for Hewlett-Packard, HP. He has a background of 15 years in police law enforcement and investigation in Southeast Asia and Europe. The last 10 years have added a wide variety of commercial sector experience of planning, managing responsibilities, including IPR investigation and enforcement. In his current role, Chris is responsible for directing and managing services in support of employee security, the security of fixed assets and the supply chain, the investigation of internal compliance issues, and the counterfeiting of HP products. Chris has a BSc honors in sociology and politics and a postgraduate diploma in risk and risk management. Now I would like to invite Mr. Chris Merchant to give his statement. Let's welcome.
So good morning, everybody. Honoured to be here and very grateful for the opportunity on behalf of Hewlett-Packard and also on behalf of the private sector, because I'm going to try and make my comments relevant to as much of us from the private and business sector as possible in a generic kind of a way. So we look forward to your participation and questions subsequent to the presentations. So the topic is acceptable solutions for all stakeholders in an attempt to recover the costs from the infringer. Well, it's thanks to organizations like WIPO, WCO, Interpol, BASCAP and Inter that we are here and able to discuss this important topic over the course of these 2 days. HP is a member of BASCAP. And I'll talk a little bit about them and some of the work that they're producing at the moment, because I think it's very relevant to what we're going to talk about this morning. BASCAP has released a paper on the estimating the global economic and social impacts of counterfeiting and piracy, which is available from their stand. And the reason I highlight this is because what I want to do before we get really stuck into the conversation is just to make sure we're all on the same page about the size of the problem that we're dealing with from an industry point of view. The OECD study a couple of years ago estimated the problem in the range of $250 billion a year. While a recent study which BASCAP has been involved with sets that quite a bit higher, taking a number of other factors into account in the range of $400 to $600 billion a year. So I think we can all say it's a pretty big problem. Counterfeit goods are not made by the rights holder. They're not transported or imported by the rights holder. They're not the property of the rights holder. And they're not sold and distributed by the rights holder. And we derive absolutely no profit from counterfeit goods. Who loses? Counterfeits damage industries, the reputations and prospects of the rights holders. They cause potential or actual harm, as has been extensively documented in recent years, to citizens of our countries, loss of revenue, duties and taxes to government, and they damage nascent industries in a local environments. Employment and legitimate trade are hampered where counterfeit is manufactured and distributed. And who benefits? The organised criminals who produce and sell counterfeits, and the participants in the supply chain who are paid to distribute and transport and deliver the counterfeit goods, knowingly or unknowingly. And I think, as perhaps we'll see later on, there are examples of both. And the profits from the sale of these goods go to organised crime, to furthering the activities of organised crime. Who pays at the moment? Well, we've heard some acknowledgement from the speakers already that the costs fall currently to law enforcement, the state, and to the rights holders. So some common scenarios because that we deal with and I deal with from a day-to-day basis with my team. At a customs border seizure, the product is seized, the rights holder identifies them as counterfeit, and from that point we have the opportunity to start a legal action, and we're generally responsible for the storage costs from that point and for their destruction. We may get a court ruling enabling us to get the cost back from the importer, the originator of the counterfeit products, and as we've heard already, it's often very difficult or impossible to make that process work. If a police case is conducted internal to a country, it's obviously usually a criminal case, and all costs are generally speaking borne by the police and the state, the storage and destruction. If it's a civil process, which we launch ourselves, and we do that often, frequently, then as a rights holder we bear the costs for that process and have the opportunity to recover them from the defendants, if we get a judgment in the case. So I'm not a lawyer and I'm not going to go into technical legal issues, but we see both under the TRIPS process and the excellent, which has excellent provisions, and the European Regulation 1383, which has some very, very good provisions and has been continuously developed and improved with active partnership from the business over the last few years. Things which need working on and improving and developing. We need, from a rights holder's perspective, to see a number of further developments in this process. So we've heard about this simplified procedure, and I'll just make a quick comment about that. It's a fantastic process in the EU. However, it's not implemented across the board. There are many countries who have not implemented the simplified procedure. There are national legislation issues, and in some cases, even when the simplified procedure is implemented, storage can continue for some considerable time, and costs mount up. We've, the counterfeit problem is not going to go away. The volume is growing. It's becoming more and more criminalized, and we think that the supply chain, which Patrick talked about very eloquently, is where we should be focusing. All participants bear some responsibility and in some cases liability in the distribution of counterfeits from where they're manufactured to where they're passed on to the public. And we, as industry, want to see this as a joint process going forward where all parties play an active and equal role in trying to find the best solutions. So if we move on to some examples. I'll just give you from my industry, and I'm not going to identify the companies concerned, just to give you an idea of the kinds of costs that some of us are bearing. One case here, $30 million worth of goods seized in the Middle East, a monthly storage cost of $12,000 a month, been going on for many months, and then the destruction costs to pay at the end of that. That's from one seizure. Hewlett-Packard seized well over 100 million counterfeit items. I'm not going to give you the value of that, but it's considerable, and we are responsible for paying from the bottom line for the destruction and disposal of those products. So, just to give you an idea of the kind of financial situation that we're in from the private sector and the commitment that we're making. We would like to see on the supply chain a very careful look at all the participants, the carriers, the forwarders, the importers, the consigners, the declarants, and Patrick has named some of the points, so I'm not going to go into them, because we feel that there are gaps in the legislation and the regulations that exist that don't control, for instance, the sufficiency of the contractual relationship between the supply chain elements. Let me be generic there, not to risk upsetting anybody, and that they manage to avoid their responsibilities in law by washing their hands of the issue once counterfeit goods are discovered and detained. They then step away from the issue, and it's impossible for us to recover costs once we have a judgment. So I think there's quite a lot that we need to do and we can talk about, and hopefully if we stimulate some discussion, we can see some key points that might come out of that. But that's something we should be looking at. We have, as an operational example, several instances where forwarders are sending goods having received advance payment to fraudulent and non-existent addresses. That speaks to the lack of due diligence that some parties to the supply chain are involving themselves with, and that's not acceptable. Mr. Zhu has made the point, and so has Antonis. Should pay the costs, but we have significant difficulties in identifying and tracking them down. And if we go on to some of the other issues that are raised on the points we're talking about today, financial constraints for developing countries. This is an issue, and we as business see this on a day-to-day basis. We are growing, all of us, attempting to grow our businesses in the developing world, and are very conscious of the difficulties of doing that. And one of the impediments to successfully expanding our businesses is counterfeiting. And we invest heavily in supporting training to law enforcement, customs, judges, and all elements of what's going on there in developing the judiciary and the whole legal system in countries which are struggling to deal with these issues. We, of course, are legitimate investors in businesses in these countries. We pay taxes, and our interest is in building a sustainable process, which counterfeiting and everything associated with it clearly doesn't do. I've got a couple of examples of documents here, which I think I'd urge you all to take away. Recently issued by BASCAP. Current and emerging intellectual property issues for businesses. And that's not just for Hewlett-Packard. In fact, it's aimed more at the SME market. So a clear issue there. And finally, talking about the contribution of the private sector to cost-effective and socially relevant enforcement. We think that improving the legal framework to make for instance, simplified destruction processes work more effectively and more quickly will save all of us a lot of money and time and effort. That more efforts need to be made. We would like to engage in recycling and destruction more than we do, but the facilities are often not there to make this possible. And on that note, I'll stop and say thank you very much for the opportunity.
So thank you, Mr. Chris Merchant. So Mr. Merchant gave us a very informative picture, different picture from the perspective of rights holders. So our next speaker is Mr. Stephen Morris. So for the over 45 years, Mr. Morris has operated in both public and private sectors' capability in the field of regulatory compliance in particular that related to customs, biosecurity, transport security, and other trade-related matters. This presentation, as the director of several international, regional, and national non-governmental entities, has seen him represent those bodies at the WCO, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, and other international and regional forums. He holds a Master of Justice and other qualifications in law, accounting, and international trade. In his capacity at the FIATA and the CBFCA, he represents the interests of service providers in international trade logistics and supply chain management. Now I give floor to Mr. Morris. Let's welcome him with applause.
Thank you, Mr. Zhu, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A different perspective, yes, you'll certainly get that from me in relation to intermediaries and how they fit into the process. I think in relation to liability and to the cost in relation to storage and destruction, this is a very complex question, and it's very similar to the social requirements in terms of health, education, law enforcement. We all want it, but no one wants to pay for it. And so in this regard, the question that we'll focus on here and what we are trying to address at the pointy end of the discussions is who pays, why they pay, and when they pay in terms of this. I'm here to look after the interests of humble service providers in international trade, logistics and supply chain managements. And these are international freight forwarders, whether they be in road, rail, air or sea. My simple message to you is don't shoot the messenger. In reality, do not shoot the international freight forwarder who is part of the supply chain continuum in carrying these goods into the country. Very quickly in relation to FIATA, it's a non-governmental organisation based in Zurich. It represents 103 economies and has 112 industry associations in those 103 economies. Within those 112 members at national levels, it has at or about 38,000 individual members or entities, which employ about 1.5 million people in international freight forwarding and supply chain management issues worldwide. The position in terms of the institutes and the advisory bodies in there are to provide direction and guidance to the board of FIATA in terms of policy positions on key issues. That's not my day job. My day job in Australia is to look after the interests and welfare of customs brokers and freight forwarders in that country. In simple terms, international freight forwarders are parties providing services for took an interest in the issues relating to intellectual property rights, liabilities and cost of destruction when the anti-counterfeiting trade agreement paper first saw its public viewing, in which there were particular issues in there which were of concern to FIATA in terms of the liabilities and costs which may fall to service providers in international trade logistics and supply chain management. In particular, the issues as referenced in Article 2 as to border measures, customs initiatives in terms of intervention and goods in transit. FIATA issued a position paper on this particular aspect in September 2010. However, it should be noted that FIATA supports and endorses the anti-counterfeiting trade agreement and the work done under TRIPS. It notes the need for government and regulators, particularly as to community obligations in terms of safety and health, to intervene in areas where counterfeit goods have been imported into those countries. In a health perspective, it might be medicines, it might be health care, it might be chemicals, it might be pesticides or herbicides. It sees the need for intervention in that area. In terms of safety or security, it looks at products which have implications for people's well-being, whether they be optical, whether they be transport, or whatever the case may be. It also notes with particular interest the area of a high level of counterfeit, piracy and intellectual property infringement, and that will be either in the media, through publications, or through textile clothing and footwear. It's really interesting that there is a different dichotomy between those issues of safety and health as against what we could class as social gratification or personal gratification, i.e. I would like that product, but I'm not in a position to pay a full price for it. So we have consumers of particular items aiding and abetting the process of counterfeiting and piracy. However, for service providers, this is an issue that is not of their concern. The aspects for them in terms of movement of cargo or movement of freight is to comply with regulatory requirements, and those regulatory requirements in the main are those related to border intervention from customs authorities, from agriculture or biosecurity authorities, and from the key areas of transport security. Over and above that, they have commercial requirements that they must comply with in terms of airlines and shipping lines in terms of cargo receipt and delivery. So we look at the road haulier, the railway, the airlines, air freight terminals and air cargo terminals, shipping lines through their terminals and with stevedores. In simple terms, the supply chain continuum has to be managed from end to end, and IPR is part of that inherent continuum of management. The FIATA position paper of September 2010 made a couple of issues that I would like to address with you and point out. It makes the comment, international freight forwarders cannot be held responsible for the assessment of IPR infringement for a variety of legal and contractual reasons, including, inter alia, IPR issues are not the responsibility of the service provider in the contract of carriage. We heard from Chris that in certain cases, people have been known to work outside those contract of carriage requirements and knowingly create IPR issues. That doesn't fall within that broad statement that is made there. Goods in the main cannot be cited or verified as contracts and regulatory, including customs, biosecurity and transport security, do not allow for the opening, altering or interfering with consignments after they've been received for export. Information received and provided to regulators by service providers is based upon that supplied by the consignee, consignor or other third parties. An IPR verification is not a business requirement of service providers, and in the main, only the IPR holder is in a position to verify whether the IPR has been infringed. So they were some of the key elements in the FIATA position paper. In terms of storage and destruction and liability issues, there are two issues that need to be addressed by service providers. One relates to the goods themselves, and that's fine, and we can talk about IPR, and the other relates to the goods in which the goods are carried, that is, containers or whatever the case may be. In the container industry or in shipping industry, you only have a certain number of days in which you will have to take your containers from the waterfront and then for those containers to be returned. Any time outside that detention or demurrage period raises an issue as to cost in terms of containers. So while IPR holders and the regulators might be trying to determine who is responsible for what and how it is, the issue in relation to returned equipment for shipping lines and airlines needs to be addressed. So the regulators and the IPR holders need to determine a time frame for the determination of an IPR breach. The legal process has to be short and sharp, and we also have to take into consideration that the importer of record may actually abandon the goods and walk from them. So, the active remedies are as simple as they can be complex, and what we see is that national legislation needs to determine policy and process to clearly address the issues as to liability, costs and other issues, and there must be full transparency and consultation in that process. I note from the previous congresses in Geneva, Dubai and in Cancun that there has been a similarity in direction and guidance, and I see that what we're talking about here is moving on those concepts that have been agreed in those three congresses. My closing remarks are that ACTA is not the silver bullet. It is one of the tools in the toolbox. There needs to be the challenge of integration of policy and process between the regulator and the private sector. Now the question is who is the private sector? It's that amorphous mass. It's intermediaries, it's IPR holders, it is other parties that have an interest in the process. I would suggest to you that in terms of some of these issues being addressed, that they need to be bottom-up driven, that is in the national context through to regional and through to international forums, while the international forum can still overarchingly underpin what work is going to be done. And in my final comment, I think the greatest threat to IPR has yet to fully materialise, and it's been addressed in the forums here, and that is in relation to sales over the internet. You have ease of access, unanimity, you have distribution channels already put in place for you by regulatory agencies such as postal authorities with their express consignment options and through express carriers themselves. How do we get around this? Well, perhaps things like the United States Customs and Border Protection's importer security filing and the use of technology may support that issue. So, in summation, what we're talking about today in terms of the pointy end of who's paying and who may have to pay is an issue that there is a difference of opinion on, and that difference of opinion will continue to swirl. All I can say in relation to the internet, and we will be moving in the next 5 years in terms of the challenge for IPR holders and for regulatory agencies and for the private sector itself, is that we live in interesting times. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Mr. Morris. Mr. Morris approached the issue from different angles, especially mentioned the carriers and the forwarders. So every one of them gave us a very strong argument. But personally, I would like to ask a question. So who is the infringer? Why they infringe? So everyone knows for the purpose of the huge profit. But where does the profit go? So a lot of questions. So next will be a discussion. Yesterday, the speakers, we had a very intensive discussion. They give me some examples to show who should be responsible for the costs. For example, Mr. Chris told me the rights holders, the counterfeit goods are not made the rights holders, not transported by the right holders, and not in the property of the right holders. They are not imported or sold by the right holders, and the right holders derives no profit. So Morris also gave me another example. They say, if a person carrying drugs is arrested, it is the responsibility of the carrier or forwarders. And according to the EU legislation, it seems customs should not be paid pay the cost for the destruction and storage of counterfeit goods. So what should we do? Who should bear the costs for the storing and disposing of counterfeit goods? Next is our discussion. As we all know, is it the public authority? It is already a heavy burden on the developing countries. Is it the right holders? They were all already prejudiced. Is it the infringers? If and where to find them? So is it intermediaries? So next is our discussion. So we will have a roundtable discussion. Your participation is welcome. Anyone who would like to take the floor to start the discussion? Any one of you? Okay, please.
Well, yeah, I'll break the. I think so. Yeah, I'll break the ice on this and really echo Mr. Ju's request. You know, we're all interested parties here. Let's hear from you. You know, what would you like to ask? You know, what would you like to pose us?
To add to what Chris is saying and what Mr. Zhu indicated, I think we had a very fruitful discussion sometimes yesterday. It extended to this morning. And it will be interesting to hear from the floor as well, to exchange ideas and so on. I can tell you now, as I was earlier indicating, that the cost of the fighting of these IPR and counterfeit goods to government, as the Secretary General of the WCO indicated yesterday, on the 17th of January, we paid an ultimate cost to fighting IPR in South Africa. We lost an officer who was working towards that. So the measurement of that cannot only be in terms of the tangible dollar and rand that you put on this thing. Application of resources in areas where they could have at least been put in other high priority activities is also a cost. So we need to think along those particular lines as well.
Well, I would say that first of all, we have been told that there's a massive problem of counterfeit, and this is quite clear. And secondly, there is a massive problem for storage and the cost of destruction. It is increasing. So we are faced with a massive challenge. Secondly, we live in a world of supply chain. In a world of supply chain, there is all the elements of the supply chain are relevant when it comes to fighting fraud, actually fighting counterfeit, ensuring product safety, and indeed security. So there's a supply chain approach that would be appropriate to more and more to organize in order to be more effective in also in fighting counterfeit and enforcing IPR. And if we do take that view, then the contractual relations between the elements of the supply chain are very relevant, and there's a need to see how through these contractual relations it is possible to trace the infringer or infringers, who ultimately, of course, need to pay for the counterfeit. So that, I would say, is a very useful and innovative approach to the debate that can be taken forward.
Can I ask a question? Yes, please. Okay.
I'm working for the pesticide industry, but I think I represent all brand owners, and I'm a member of BASCAP as well. Brand owners give billions of dollars worth of business to vessel companies to transport product, legitimate product. Now we're starting to discover that our own service providers, the vessel companies, are also counterfeiting and transporting the counterfeits, knowingly or unknowingly. So this is really not an issue of IPR. This is an issue of, does your CEO and your respective companies know that on one hand, you've got service providers delivering your legitimate product, and your very same service providers are delivering the counterfeit product to the EU. So really, it's a question for the CEOs to ask. You know, it's a question for the audit departments, because you can't have a vessel company that's legitimately delivering your product and at the same time delivering counterfeit products. Two, when we find the product that's counterfeit, the brand owner gets stuck with the destruction cost. We go back to the vessel companies, they say it's not our problem. However, the vessel company has already been paid by the counterfeiter. The money is already in their pocket. They've made their profit. So I've asked a few vessel companies, hey, why don't you pitch in the storage and destruction costs? You've already made your money off the counterfeiter. Oh, no. EU regulation prevents it from happening, this, that, and other. So here's another thought for the EU. In the times of crisis that we've got now in finance, how can you possibly allow this under insist that legitimate companies are paying for the crimes of others? Okay, I mean, in the United States, customs pays for the storage and destruction costs of counterfeits. But here, just let's take it away from IPR again. This is just pure old unfair business practices. And at the same time, the delivery boys that are people who are bringing in the counterfeits to the EU, they've got the money in the pocket, they say goodbye, they go back to the same counterfeiter and deliver another load in, and they hide behind the EU regulation. So, but the good news of this story is I'm going to the CEOs of different companies now, and I'm telling them that their own service providers and the delivery boys and the vessel companies are also dealing with counterfeits. They're going straight to their audit departments and their corporate governance departments, and they're saying to their logistics departments, you make sure that our vessel companies have an anti-counterfeiting policy in place and that they engage in at the minimum of due diligence so they know that they're not dealing with counterfeiters. I'm not asking the vessel companies to look what's inside the box. I'm asking them to ask one simple question: who are you? But up to this point, the vessel companies are saying, we have no legal obligation to do anything other than to deliver. But the thing that gets everybody's goats, including the CEOs of the clients of the vessel companies, is the vessel company's already been paid by the counterfeiter. They've got the money, and we end up paying the destruction costs. So there's a lot of things that have nothing to do with the IPR, nothing to do with changing laws. It's changing business practices, okay? So if the vessel company wants the business of a legitimate company, they're going to have to start asking of their of their customers, who are you, to avoid the counterfeiters.
Okay, thank you. Would you like to take this issue?
Hi. Hi. I'm from Canada, and I wrote an article last year on this issue that Mr. Mung was talking about. It's very difficult to catch intermediaries under IPR laws because, for instance, with trademark law in Canada, Australia, there's a use requirement, so you're never, ever going to catch the intermediaries for infringement directly. So I think the legal solutions have to come from other kinds of concepts like contract law or coming up with different legal solutions. You're not going to resolve it in terms of liability that way.
Thank you. It's becoming exciting because it's like somebody was sitting in our discussion this morning and yesterday, and we had an issue relating to what the previous speaker before the madam was saying about what kind of due diligence can we devolve to other role players. And I think the point that you are raising in terms of the IPR laws, can we extend it to intermediaries? The purpose of that particular thing being raised was to elicit a discussion that says, can we come up with a possible solution or something that we can share and take out of here to our respective areas and include it maybe in our national legislations to say, is there a way that some form of responsibility in the form of contractual obligations can make the role players to play a certain role to ensure that, one, they know their clients, or they know that within reasonable boundaries that the goods that they are carrying are not in an infringement of any particular law. So that is the kind of discussion that we are trying to engage in here, to say that can you apply some form of risk management, devolve it to the role players within the chain management, say you as the person. I mean, if you look at the principle applied with the City Pet program, you devolve the responsibility along the entire supply chain. Somebody plays a certain role in there. So that is what I wanted to indicate.
Any other questions? Okay, please.
Yeah, good morning. My name's Michael Ellis. I'm from a skincare company called Beiersdorf, based in Germany. I want to go over a few things that Chris mentioned in terms of the private sector. So you have to remember, private sector is paying for investigations. Often in the source countries, we're paying for surveillance, we're paying to track the factories where this product is produced. We pay for subsequent legal costs when the products are seized. We're paying for storage costs if product is seized and stored by customs. We're paying for destruction costs. It's one of those incredible crime areas where the victim is paying. If somebody breaks into my house, steals my jewellery, I go to the police, he's arrested. I don't have to pay for this service. That my product is returned to me. I don't have to pay for this. But IP crime is one of those areas where we invariably, as the private sector, have to pay all the way along the line. Mr. Morris spoke about the liability issues of the shippers, and particularly that they can't be held responsible for IPR. Goods can't be verified once they've been boxed, once they've been put into the containers for whatever regulatory reasons that are in place. But really interesting for me is you made a reference to the internet, and you may know that private sector have been engaged for some 18 months in dialogue with the internet, with the market, with the ISPs, people selling products on the internet, to try to come together some sort of understanding, MOUs, etc., with these guys who are allowing their marketplaces to sell counterfeit product. And you know, through the Vero program, for example, eBay, if the private sector give them information, they will take away that person's right to sell product. And the specific question I'd ask you is there a mechanism within the members of FIATA that we as brand holders could ask for some similar sort of cooperation? And the specific cooperation I would mean, for example, is that if and when counterfeit products are found in possession of your members, having been shipped by your members, I understand perhaps you would say there's no liability in terms of destruction costs, etc., etc. But you perhaps would agree that you have a lot of information about who that shipper is. You have a lot of information about who the sender is, perhaps. Often false addresses are given, often front companies are used, etc., etc. But somewhere in that financial chain, there'll be a bank account. There may be a means or a mechanisms where we can actually get information from you in the same way that we have that cooperation at the moment with people like eBay or the internet marketplaces. Do you ever envisage that there could be some cooperation along those lines with your membership?
It's a pretty interesting question in terms of how you would drill down and put that to the service providers within the associations at a national level. I think if that was a policy determinant, that there is an expectation that members of those associations would look to work in those type of environments, yes, I could see that would work. However, I think one of the comment that I liked is turning this argument around and don't take it on an IPR issue, bring it back to contractual issues on the process. And I thought the comment was really good that you have an anti counterfeiting policy within your organisation's framework of business, and that itself then turns those issues in doing business with any client into a much better and more viable position to achieve the goals that you're after. I think from a FIATA point of view, its exposure to rights holders and the issues that you've seen over the last, or I've seen over the last 2 days, is an issue where there has been very little dialogue between the parties, and I think that's an area where there could be improvement in the information exchange, which would support some of those issues that you need to have information, and you have to build that trust in the marketplace.
Okay, due to the time constraint, the last question. Okay,
Thank
please.
you very much. I'm Christina Slidzinska. I work for INTA. I represent INTA in Brussels. And I have a question which is addressed to Mr. Gastrisianakis from the European Commission. You talked about the work that you're doing actually the customs regulation which guides the work of customs in the EU is being reviewed as well. You did mention the enforcement directive, but the customs regulation is being reviewed. There was a public consultation last year, I think, just before the summer. And we're wondering what will be the next steps? When will the Commission be making proposals to guide the work of customs in the EU to alleviate some of the concerns of brand owners? You have heard many of them here today. And could you maybe give some insight into what the consultation provided in terms, because there has been basically silence radio since that consultation took place? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the question. Indeed, we are in the process of reviewing internally the IPR enforcement regulation, for customs enforcement regulation in the EU, and following the public consultation, we would expect that in coming months there will be a proposal from the European Commission. I would not wish to go into any detail about the content of the potential content of this proposal, but one of our main concerns is how to ensure that the whole process becomes more efficient, more effective, and faster. And so the emphasis has been given by some speakers on simplified procedures is one that we are very seriously examining. But since I have the floor, may I also say that with the supply chain approach, the question of whether you can apply IPR enforcement at the border in an effective way is only a limited one. That is, you have to have a broader approach across the economy, and not just what customs do at the border in order to enforce the IPR. The marketplace is where the counterfeit is actually channeled, and actually in the marketplace is equally relevant. So this also means that because of a supply, put the question about the contractual relationship more generally, I'm very sensitive to the question that was, or the statement was the lady made earlier on about the need to think about changes in contractual law when it comes especially to the distinction between also between criminal and private and civil law. How the responsibility of the state compares with the responsibility of the other participants. A reference was made to CityPat. We in the EU have a system of authorized economic operators. And I think it would be useful to think about the role of authorized economic operators in future about in the policy of IPR enforcement. And finally, let me also recall what I said in the beginning, that there is an EU consultation, public consultation ongoing, and there is an invitation to all of you to come and contribute. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So as this is a very complicated global issue, so we cannot find the final solution to the issue in such a short time. But it seems we can agree, we can suggest, we can examine this issue in a global context, in a wider framework of IPR enforcement legislation. So at least the 3 points I think maybe we can have consensus on. The first, we should improve the legislations, maybe widen the legislation, including just as ladies mentioned, even the contractual legislation could be part of the legislation. Secondly, to strengthen the cooperation between the rights holders, the private sectors, public, and government agencies. The third one, we should find the practical measures to how to improve the situation. So I think this could be a very short summary. I hope it is reasonable, but we cannot solve the problem, solve the issue in just one seminar or discussion. So let's just thank the speakers from different sectors with a loud applause, okay? So I would like to thank you for your participation, and also thank the interpreters for their wonderful interpretation. Thank you. Thank you very much.